Hola a todos y a todas los asistentes. Vamos a esperar unos minutos que se vayan integrando más para poder empezar este panel 9.
Sí, Cami, Anastasia, Sian y Michael Henderson ya están acá, ¿cierto? Cami, ¿me escuchas?
Muy buenas tardes, muy buenos días, según el horario en que les corresponde estar. Quiero darles la bienvenida, quiero agradecerles que estén acá. Para quienes saben, estamos recién saliendo del panel 8, donde hubo muchas preguntas e inquietudes, y eso nos hizo demorarnos unos minutos. Entonces, en honor al tiempo, porque estamos con algunos minutos de retraso, quiero darles la bienvenida. Entonces, muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes a todos los asistentes y a los panelistas. Como bien saben, mi nombre es Verónica Villarroel, directora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación, y a nombre de la Facultad de Psicología de la Universidad del Desarrollo quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida a nuestro segundo encuentro internacional virtual en enseñanza, aprendizaje y evaluación en educación superior. Hoy es nuestro noveno panel y es nuestro último día de transmisión de esta actividad. Como bien saben, lo tengo que plantear por si alguien en estos momentos aún no lo ha hecho, tengo que darles algunas instrucciones respecto a la traducción simultánea. Para poder contar con interpretación simultánea, deben seleccionar el icono del globo terráqueo que encuentran en la barra inferior de su panel de Zoom. Al pinchar, seleccionan el idioma en que quieran escuchar toda la actividad, sin importar el idioma en que hable el expositor, por tanto pueden escuchar todo en español o todo en inglés. Vamos a estar pendientes al chat, y ahí también en el chat voy a poner alguna información específica al respecto. Los invitamos a participar también de esta actividad realizando preguntas a lo largo de este evento, en la sección preguntas y respuestas, que tienen las siglas A y Q, que están en la barra inferior del Zoom, y les pedimos que usen el chat solo para hacernos preguntas de temas técnicos. Les comento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal streaming de la universidad, uddtv.udd.cl. Esperamos que hoy la tecnología y las conexiones nos acompañen, como ha sido durante estos 9 paneles, pero les pedimos consideración si tuviésemos algún problema técnico en la charla. Agradecemos mucho a todos los inscritos e interesados en participar, Le pedimos siempre informarse de nuestras actividades en la web psicología.udd.cl y en nuestras redes sociales @psicologiaUDD. Vamos a iniciar entonces este panel con la ponencia de la doctora Anastasia Lipnevich, espero haberlo pronunciado decentemente, titulada Modelo de Interacción Estudiante Retroalimentación que fomenta la autorretroalimentación. La doctora Anastasia Lipnevich es profesora de Psicología Educacional en Queens College y en el Centro de Graduados de City University of New York. Originaria de Bielorrusia, la doctora Lipnevich recibió su maestría combinada en Psicología Clínica, Educación e Idioma Italiano en la Universidad Pedagógica Estatal de Bielorrusia, seguida de su maestría en Psicología de Consejería en la Universidad Rutgers en Estados Unidos. Luego obtuvo su doctorado en Psicología Educacional, Aprendizaje, Cognición, Concentración del Desarrollo en la misma universidad. Después de recibir su doctorado, se unió al Educational Testing Service en Princeton, Nueva Jersey, como investigadora de postdoctorado. Recibió el premio al Nuevo Investigador 2011 en Psicología Experimental de la Asociación Americana de Psicología. Además ha ocupado la categoría de profesor visitante en numerosas universidades como la Universidad de Constance, Alemania, Universidad de Otago, Nueva Zelanda, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, España, Instituto Nacional de Educación en Singapur, entre otras. Recibió el reconocimiento como Mentor International el 2021 por su trabajo con académicas jóvenes. Coeditó 2 libros, Habilidades Psicosociales y Sistemas Escolares en el siglo XXI, y Cambridge Handbook of Instructional Feedback. Actualmente sigue trabajando en algunos otros libros. Bien, bienvenida Anastasia, un gusto tenerte acá y puedes comenzar tu presentación.
All right. Ok, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias, Verónica, por presentarme e invitarme a participar en este congreso. Agradezco especialmente a Verónica por la increíble organización. Para mí es un gran honor abrir el panel final de este evento. Me complace compartir con ustedes mi trabajo y espero que podamos tener una productiva conversación alrededor de este tema de feedback. Ya hoy comparto mi pantalla. And I'm going to switch into English. All right. So let me begin. I know I'm preaching to the converted, so I do not need to work really hard trying to convince you that feedback is everywhere. And when I teach a PhD seminar, a specialized seminar in feedback and educational assessment, one of the assignments that I ask my students to complete is to select the domain of life, which is non-academic, and then analyze it using theories from cognitive psychology and educational psychology and education in terms of feedback exchanges, feedback processing. And usually I would like to say that I think it's one of my favorite activities that we do with my students of all, because it's fun and it's incredibly intellectually stimulating. So at the end of this activity, we typically draw themes, we draw parallels with instructional settings, and we derive issues and commonalities, and some of the questions that arise stimulate my research, our joint further subsequent research. And I'll give you a few examples of that. And just like everywhere in any domain of life, in education, feedback is omnipresent. And here we're talking about micro exchanges, for example, a quick remark from a peer, to very detailed and thorough analysis of our papers, for example, that come from the teacher or from our PhD supervisor. And throughout this panel, throughout this Congress, we've heard that feedback does, in many cases, make it or break it, and has the potential of influencing learning and performance on a task of our students. So I would like to share a series of studies that we conducted that show how we can harness this feedback, how we can help students uptake feedback, generate effective self-feedback. And for that, I also want to share a couple of questions that we formulated based on that assignment that we do feedback in real life. So some of the questions that we had were, does feedback, sorry, I'm covering, does student processing of feedback differ depending on individual characteristics? What type of feedback is most useful and useful for what? What are the indicators of its effectiveness? And finally, in this assignment, we try to bring it back home to the instructional setting where we discuss how we can help instructors save time, because no matter what we do in an instructional setting, still it's our job at some point to intervene and provide quality commentary to our students. So we try to investigate what it looks like in the end. Before I proceed, I would like to provide the definition. And again, throughout this symposium, we've heard so many different definitions of instructional feedback. I'll use the one that we used with, we proposed with my colleague, Jeff Smith, in our Cambridge Handbook of Instructional Feedback, where we define instructional feedback as any information related to a performance that learners can use to improve their performance in learning. And feedback might come from any source, including teachers, peers, or the task itself. It may include information on where the learner is, where the learner is going, or what steps should be taken and strategies employed to get there. We talk about different types of feedback. We also discuss different levels of processing of feedback. And here I would like to prime you with this idea that any feedback, if processed even minimally, if a student stops and thinks and considers a feedback message, becomes self-feedback or self-directed feedback. Again, throughout this symposium, in the current literature, we hear this shift in our views on feedback. So we started by looking exclusively at teachers as providers of feedback, right? And then this pendulum kind of went towards students as active agents and users and implementers of feedback and producers and generators. So in my area, in my program of study, what we do, we focus on both. We focus both on the provider and the recipient because we feel that it's equally important, because in the end, it's the teacher, it's us, the instructors in the course, who structure activities in such a way in which students can uptake and can become these effective agents and users of feedback and effective generators of feedback as well. And in terms of students being as active agents, we often hear colleagues, and we often complain about students not taking feedback, not admitting, not accepting the fact that in many cases, rejecting feedback and not interacting with feedback is actually a very effective strategy. And maybe later during the discussion, I can offer you a few ideas from personality and clinical psychology in which it's actually a very useful strategy. So in thinking about teachers and the message and all sorts of providers or different kinds of sources of feedback and students, Jeff Smith and I in 2016 derived a model which initially looked something like that. So lots of different errors and notes and concepts made no sense whatsoever. And finally, we kind of arrived at something that looks like this. And at this point, I'm going to walk you through this model, and then throughout my presentation, I'm going to illustrate each component of this model with a study that we've conducted. And I intentionally selected very similar studies methodologically so that I don't have to kind of recount the method for you every time. So we start with the context. And in our discussions of feedback in real life, we do, in real life, meaning that non-academic setting, instructional settings are real life. But we do realize that there are universal kind of tendencies. There are people who are more welcoming of feedback in general, but context does define and does influence the way feedback is influenced. So by context, we mean level of instruction. So for example, elementary school compared to middle school, to college, or to PhD level. I'm also talking about informal and formal instructional settings. So depending on the setting, the exact same message will be differentially received by students and differentially processed. When we talk about sources of feedback here, the importance is also very, very clear, because the exact same message delivered by the teacher or the computer or the peer will be processed, again, very differently by the learner in many cases. We also focus in this model on the actual feedback message, which has a number of characteristics that range from timeliness and level of detail and comprehensibility and accuracy and tone. We consider these characteristics together, and then independently, we also look at grades and praise, the summative and normative components in the feedback message. And finally, the feedback message gets to the learner, and that's the focus, the main, the core of our model. So learner comes with different characteristics. They have ability, they have different expectations, they have self-efficacy, motivation in this particular domain, and then they have different levels of receptivity to feedback. And now I keep coming back to this characteristics, to this personality trait, and I'm going to talk about it some more later. So some of us are just more receptive to feedback overall. And my colleague, Jeff Smith, with whom we devised this model, Jeff, I'm putting you on the spot, I think you're here. So he always says that even when he takes his car for service, he's nervous when the mechanic is about to tell him how his brakes are doing. So he's one of those people who is not welcoming of feedback, doesn't like receiving it. In my case, I really do like receiving feedback. So depending on these characteristics, we would respond very differently to the exact same feedback message. And then in our model, we spent a lot of time focusing on the actual processing. And here we have the trichotomy of affect, cognition, and behavior, which are described by the following questions. So a student asks, do I understand the feedback? How do I feel about this feedback? And what am I doing with the feedback? What behavioral strategy am I taking to actually implement it or reject it? And answers to these questions comprise and become the self-feedback that ultimately affects our performance and learning and transfer to similar tasks. And this sequence may repeat itself or may stop right there. So let's illustrate each component of this model, and I'll start with the context of feedback. Again, in our program of study, we research different contexts. We go from as early as kindergarten classroom to elementary. We look at different domains. For example, feedback in math domains looks very different from feedback on writing. But for this example, for this particular presentation, I chose a completely different context, which is the context of massive open online courses. And with my student, Maria Gianelli, we conducted a study in which we investigated the effects of pre-tests and feedback on learning and persistence in a massive open online course on a climate change. Okay, so it's a completely different context. The study was conducted, the course was offered through Coursera, one of the largest providers of MOOC, and American Museum of Natural History. So the quality of the course was simply exceptional. And as you probably know, in general, attrition in MOOCs is between 92 and 97%. And in the American Museum of Natural History, it's 91.78%. So our final, we started with thousands of participants. In the end, we ended up with 606. So here are the conditions that we had. So the course was 5 weeks, 5 individual modules, and we administered a pretest. So we were thinking that a pretest should prime participants on the material that we deem to be important. So students took a multiple choice test in the beginning, and then we assigned them to different conditions. So the experimental conditions had pretest with no feedback. We had pretest with basic correct, incorrect feedback. And then we had a condition that received really elaborate feedback. So which explained the answer, why the answer was incorrect, which answer was correct and why. And then we administered post-test to all. And here you can venture your guesses on how do you think the conditions fared, whether pretest or feedback, which conditions had which effect. So I will tell you that we found that pretest and feedback did not affect outcomes in any way. So it was one of those studies in which we found no significant differences among these conditions. So we were thinking, what's going on here? Because we know that feedback has a potential of helping students. So yeah, possibly in our case, the manipulation didn't work, but we provided all different types of feedback. There has got to be something. But then in the end, we arrived at this explanation that it's just that the context of massive open online courses is just too different from a traditional setting. And students have very limited prior knowledge. So before providing them with feedback, students needed basic instruction. And this is something that translates directly into our classrooms, college classrooms, and any classroom, high school classrooms, any classrooms that we teach. In some cases, and when we look at individual students, if they do not have any background knowledge, this feedback does not have any basis onto which to get appended. So as a result, there is limited purpose in the feedback. So again, consideration of prior knowledge is always very important. And then participants' individual characteristics such as motivation is critically important, because in MOOCs, the purpose of the motivation behind taking the course is very different from that in a traditional setting. So another way of thinking about it, the context of a traditional instruction, when you get and take climate change course in a college classroom, right? So there is a syllabus, and there is, if you think about it, it's very similar to fixed menu. So you have your sequence of topics and sequence of modules, whereas in MOOC, students take them very non-linearly, as we discovered. So they jump from one topic to another, from one module to another. So as a result, feedback doesn't work the same way. So with encouragement of Coursera, we're now conducting a series of studies in which we manipulate feedback. We have our participants asking and requesting feedback in different domains. We measure their background information. But again, so here we're showing that context is very important, and this background knowledge of participants plays a very important role in the way the feedback gets processed. So moving on into the source and the feedback message components of our model, I'm going to report the results of a study, which I personally like very much. It's one of those, my favorite study, probably out of all that we've conducted. Again, we did it with Jeff Smith quite a while ago. So we looked at different types of feedback. We examined effects of grades, praise, and detailed comments. And we also looked at sources of feedback. We presented the exact same detailed comments to our participants, but we manipulated their perception of the source. So we said some students thought that the comments came from the computer. In other cases, participants thought that comments came from the instructor, and we looked at how they responded to it. So the first study was an experimental study. We had 464 general psychology students participating. And in the second study, we had focus groups with selected participants. So students came into a computer lab, worked on an essay, which was part of their course requirements. So it was supposed to be taken seriously. Then we provided them with this differential feedback. And then a week later, they came back and worked on their revisions. And then we looked at their performance, quality of their revisions as well. So this is the distribution of conditions. So we have 3 by 2 by 2 design. So we have detailed comments with an understanding that they came from the instructor, detailed comments with an understanding that they came from the computer, and no feedback, and then crossed with praise and grade. So here is what we found. We found that students who did not receive any detailed comments, and here we have groups that have combinations of no grade, no praise, no grade, praise, grade, no praise, and grade, praise. So their mean scores were very close, but they performed significantly lower, significantly worse than students in either computer instructor condition. And as I said, as we look closer at the means, we see that in the no feedback and the computer condition, the means of the groups are quite close. So it didn't really matter whether we added grade, we added praise, the performance was quite similar, which is not the case in the instructor condition. So in the instructor condition, the highest performing groups were those that did not receive grade on their intermediate draft. Okay, and the group that was the lowest performing group in the instructor condition was the one that received a grade on top of their detailed comments, but no praise statement. So they didn't perform differently from the group that did not receive any comments whatsoever, which in a way makes sense, because if you are about to watch a game, for example, a game of football, and somebody tells you the score, suddenly watching the game is not interesting anymore because you already have the final result. So this is something that happened in this case with the grade. So this is a kind of close up on the differences in graded and non-graded condition. Again, we can see that students who did not receive detailed comments and received grade and praise their performance was very similar. In the computer, it didn't matter at all whether grade was presented. And in the instructor, we have this discrepancy, significant discrepancy in scores. So it all means that students use feedback, they need feedback, and they need the opportunity to revise. When they're offered the opportunity to revise, they can use it. Detailed specific comments are most conducive to improvement. We also found that grades on intermediate drafts are not effective in promoting improvement at all. Praise mitigates the negative effect of grades, and source matters. So students did better when they thought that the feedback came from the instructor. It was the best scoring condition, and they tended to dismiss some of the comments from supposedly computer. And the type of the feedback matter. Again, we are not the only source of feedback, but as long as we have face-to-face instruction and face-to-face interaction or some kind of interaction with our students, we will still be providing these feedback messages to them. And we need to be mindful of the kind of messages we provide. And I'll share more studies that attest to that illustrate that. Now, individual characteristics. There is no way, there is not enough time in this entire symposium to cover all individual characteristics that we've studied. As I said, ability matters, prior knowledge matters. And here I would like to spend a little bit of time on the receptivity to feedback. Once again, from our feedback in non-academic settings exercise, we started wondering if there is a universal acceptance of feedback. So we designed a scale, which is a global receptivity to feedback scale. But we also designed a receptivity to instructional feedback scale. And at this point, it's been tested. We've collected data in Singapore, in Spain, in the United States and New Zealand, across different educational levels. Right now, we have data collection planned in Nigeria. And the structure of the scale replicates consistently, and we've run lots of model equivalence across genders and across different educational levels. So it so appears that this receptivity to instructional feedback can be defined through 4 factors. The first one is experiential attitudes, is your enjoyment of feedback. So it's illustrated by the item, I enjoy learning how well I did on tests and assignments. There is instrumental attitudes. It's your value, perception of value. Instructor's feedback is very effective in helping me enhance my performance. There is cognitive engagement. I understand how to use feedback. And then behavioral engagement, which is the actual behavioral strategies. So I rework my assignments based on the feedback that I receive. Those of you who've worked with me, you probably heard me mention jingle jangle more often than you wanted me to say it. So I'm always terrified of this jingle jangle phenomenon when researchers introduce a new concept that has a new and really attractive meaning. And then when studies are conducted, this new concept gets subsumed under something that already exists. So in personality psychology, and again, I'm coming from my training is in psychometrics, and I worked at the Center for Non-Cognitive Assessment. So this was our work to see if the new introduced concepts are really incrementing over the big 5 personality factors. So we did this work with the receptivity to instructional feedback. And we found that the highest correlations between the big 5 personality factors and receptivity to feedback are with conscientiousness and openness. So students who are disciplined, who are achievement-oriented, they have higher scores on receptivity of feedback, and students who are curious and open to new information would also be more welcoming of feedback. Interestingly, and kind of goes against our predictions and our hypothesis, agreeableness yielded very weak, significant but very weak links with the receptivity to instructional feedback factors, meaning that students who tend to be cooperative are not as receptive to feedback compared to students who are disciplined and who are open to new information. Neuroticism also negatively predicted behavioral engagement. It means that students who are self-conscious and who are impulsive would not have such a wide arsenal and would not be as motivated and inclined to actually work on the feedback that they receive. So this is all encouraging findings. The correlations were in the 0.25 to 0.35 range. So it means that receptivity to instructional feedback is not the same as personality, like, for example, grit and conscientiousness. So we recently completed the study and just submitted a couple of manuscripts in Singapore. So we had 5 schools, 15 classes, and 3 waves of data collection in which we collected information, collected feedback that the teachers provided on various assignments. We also indexed their emotions. So the moment when students received feedback, they had to report, we asked them to report on their emotions. We also collected information on grades, and they completed the receptivity to instructional feedback scale. And we found that gender, along with the 4 factors of receptivity to instructional feedback, predicted grades in wave 1 and wave 3. So it means that there is a value in measuring and indexing receptivity to instructional feedback. We also found that students who scored higher on receptivity tended to have higher emotions and vice versa. So so students with higher scores on experiential attitudes and instrumental attitudes after each feedback instance showed more positive emotions compared to those who had lower scores on receptivity to instructional feedback. And similarly with negative emotions, receptivity to instructional feedback factors had correlations with negative emotions. So what does it mean? So what can we conclude from this? In 4 countries, and also the scale is completely translated, validated, and available for use in Spanish language and in English language, we are entering the field when we are ready to conduct class-based intervention. So having this measure, which appears to work, which is different from the personality dimensions and increments over personality in predicting grades and other achievement outcomes, we can design these interventions by, for example, trying to enhance the value of feedback and teaching students specific strategies for cognitive, affective, and behavioral engagement. So now moving into the processing, the actual processing of feedback. So I'll start with affective processing. And here again, I'm just selecting out of the paper just one of the examples of this link of this path from mediation of the effect between different types of feedback and performance on a score on an essay exam. So we found a significant path between graded and not graded, when conditions in which students got a grade and didn't get a grade on their essay. And so students who received the grade, the improvement on an essay was not as significant, was not as large as improvement on an essay from students whose performance was not graded. We found the direct effect of receiving a numeric score negatively predicted their performance on an exam and positively predicted experience of negative emotion, which makes sense. So if you get a lower grade, your negative effect kind of goes up. But what's interesting about the study of affective processing, we found that experience of negative emotions may have served as a motivational factor, because the path from negative effect to improvement in essay scores is actually positive. So this is important. Why? I'm in no way encouraging you to cultivate negative effect and to elicit negative effect in your students, but at the same time, we shouldn't be as preoccupied in coddling and making sure that negative effect is not experienced. It's just part of the natural learning situation. And related to that, we are currently entering the field, and we're conducting a series of studies on biases, okay, and biases, cognitive biases, and processing of feedback. So in our anchoring bias study, we conducted, again, a similar we used a similar methodological approach in which we had students write an essay and then revise it based on detailed comments. But in some cases, students received praise. So they said, you did a fantastic job on this essay. So please try and revise to the best of your ability. And then in some cases, students were not praised on their draft. So what do we find here from this path analysis? We see that students who were praised on their performance, they were not as motivated to engage in revisions, and their performance on the final draft was not as high as for those students who were not praised on their performance. So it tells us that students may have been anchored. So they received this cognitive bias of anchoring. They were anchored on the praise statement. So as a result, their motivation to engage in revisions was actually lower compared to their counterparts who were not praised on their performance. So again, having children in schools, at least here in the United States, I observe and kind of monitor the type of feedback that they receive, and it's usually in the form of a star and a wish, a glow and grow. So there is usually an opening, glowing, positive praise statement, or the feedback, the famous feedback sandwich. So we are showing that it actually doesn't work because it takes up a lot of cognitive resources and it anchors students' thinking on things that they shouldn't be anchored on. So what does it all mean for educators? So far I've been talking about teachers providing detailed comments on an essay. So is it really realistic? What is the very minimum? How much feedback we should be providing? And is there a way to give excellent feedback and stay sane? Because those of us who've tried to provide feedback on papers in classes in which we teach, we know that it takes up so much of our time. So to solve this, we did the following. And here I really like this quote that came from professional development session with the teacher. So the teacher said, I have 120 papers to grade. If I try to provide detailed feedback on an ongoing basis, I will lose my mind. So we don't want teachers to lose my mind. We want to keep our sanity, or at least lose our mind, not because of feedback. So we did, again, a very similar methodology. We had students write an essay in a course, grade that assignment, and then we send them the following tools. We send them rubrics, exemplars, and rubrics and exemplars. And we ask them to engage in self-assessment and self-feedback generation. And we ask them to engage in revisions and improve their work based on these tools. So again, rubrics and exemplars and the combination of both were not provided in the beginning of the assignments. They were provided as feedback, all right? So here is what we found. We found that students in the rubric condition performed significantly better. They outperformed all other conditions. They outperformed exemplars, and they outperformed the combination of rubrics and exemplars. But we also, the optimistic finding was that compared to the initial baseline's performance, where, as you can see, students performed, the performance was equivalent statistically. And we can see that across these conditions, it didn't matter, rubrics, exemplars, and rubrics and exemplars, they all improved significantly from their baseline. So it means that rubrics and exemplars, the standardized feedback, instead of spending time delivering comments, we can provide students with these comparators, which are rubrics, exemplars, and we can ask them to engage in self-assessment and self-feedback generation. And in our case, we thought why rubric condition outperformed the other conditions. And one of our explanations was that it resulted in reduced cognitive load. Because when you look at an exemplar, you need to extract criteria of good performance. And then if you have multiple exemplars, which we did in our case, so we had poor, average, and high quality performance. So in this case, it was just too much information for the student to process. And as a result, maybe possibly their performance wasn't as effective. And also students tend to be, at least in the US schools and New Zealand schools, as we later established in our conversation focus group discussions with students, they said that they were much more familiar with rubrics and they knew how to use them more effectively. So to investigate this idea about familiarity, if we could train our students, we thought that we should train our students how to use rubrics. how to use exemplars and the combination of both of these tools for self-feedback generation across multiple tasks. So in our case, and the study is currently under review, we have 2 separate tasks, 2 rounds of write, revise, and resubmit. And in this case, we provided students with rubrics, exemplars, combination of both, and we also had a control group. We also conducted the training on how to use these tools before the second task. All right, so here is what we found. And again, because we have 2 tasks, so going back to the model for a second, so we are not only talking about performance on this particular task, because in the past we talked, students wrote an essay, then they received feedback, rubrics and exemplars, they generated self-feedback, and then they improved. So we're talking about performance on this specific task. In our case, we already can talk about transfer to similar tasks and even learning. So learning being a more permanent change in our long-term memory. So here are the 2 charts that we have, 2 figures that show how our students improved. So again, time 1 is when they wrote a draft of their first essay. Time 2 is where they revised it. Time 3 is when they wrote a draft of their second essay, and time 4 when they revised their second essay. So let's look at who did what, and we can see that students in the rubric condition again outperformed students on writing in all other conditions. Writing being the mechanics of writing, syntaxis and punctuation and style. Same was true for reading, and reading, this comes from a rubric from College Board, which is a standardized test in SAT. Reading being able to find arguments that support your ideas on an essay in the text that's provided along with this essay. So the task was fully standardized. And so rubric condition, once again, it improves the best. Then when we look at we conduct the training. So here a teacher for 1 hour explained and engaged students in exercises in which they explained how to compare their performance to rubrics and how to compare their performance to exemplars, how to generate self-feedback and try to improve effectively. So after that, students wrote their draft on the second prompt, which was similar, but the task was similar, but the prompt was very different. So we can see that in writing, once again, rubrics group outperformed all 3. And if you compare to the performance on the task 1, we can already make judgments, make inferences about certain transfer happening. So we can see that students in the rubric condition, their score on the time 3 on the second draft was higher than their score on the first draft. So some learning took place. And students in the reading, in terms of reading, in terms of extracting useful information out of the text, there wasn't much improvement from time 1 to time 3, but again, the 3 groups did better than the control group. And then on the revision on the second task, we can see that for writing, rubrics and exemplars outperformed the other 2 conditions, the control and the combined group for writing. And for reading, control, rubrics, exemplars, and combined conditions did the best. So it's very optimistic. It's a very optimistic finding, in our opinion, in that by providing rubrics and exemplars to our students, encouraging them to engage in self-assessment and in self-feedback generation, and by providing them with instruction, we really can achieve much improvement. We can elicit improvement in our students. But again, explicit instruction should be provided on how to use these tools. We can't assume that students would know how to self-assess properly and how to generate the self-feedback for improvement. So there is evidence of transfer to a new task. So some learning is definitely taking place. And exemplars, rubrics, and other tools that encourage student self-feedback generation work, and they save instructors time. So I'm not saying that this is a solution, a panacea, and it's going to solve all of our problems as instructors in terms of feedback. But for those of us who require our students to write essays, which is very common again in a typical US setting, we write an awful lot of essays. So we will, this will be really helpful. And I've been using this approach lately, and it's quite efficient, and students really enjoy it, and they reflect on it, and they say that it helped them significantly. So the takeaways that we have from this is that context matters, first of all. And when we see in the literature that our colleagues, and I've probably done it myself, when we make generalizations from research on high school to research on, I don't know, master's level students, we shouldn't be doing that, because it so appears that context does affect the way students process feedback. Teachers are not the only source of feedback, and we shouldn't think of it as such. And very often in our conversations about feedback, we always have the teacher as a provider of feedback. Feedback comes from different sources, and we should think about this idea that any feedback that students receive, and even minimally processed, gets converted into self-feedback. And that's where I think our focus should be. How do we help our students to generate effective self-feedback? And our role as instructors is really to structure this environment and structure conditions that help with most effective self-feedback generation, and at the same time taking responsibility for the type of feedback we provide, because no matter what, we would still have these micro exchanges. And for example, now that we know that opening praise statement may not be as beneficial if we want our students to improve, we need to keep all of that in mind. So I would like to acknowledge my team and my colleagues. So this work wouldn't have been possible without my amazing team of collaborators and my terrific CUNY team of my students. So thank you all for listening. And I think that's it for me.
Muchas gracias, Anastasia. Muy interesante tu presentación. Nos entregas muchos datos que son relevantes y seguramente van a ir apareciendo preguntas en el icono de preguntas y respuestas que más adelante vamos a retomar en la ronda final. Así que muchas gracias y vamos a continuar con la presentación del doctor Sillán, titulada Autoevaluación y literacidad en la retroalimentación. El doctor Sillán es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Currículo e Instrucción de la Universidad de Educación de Hong Kong. También es codirector del Center of Excellence in Learning and Teaching, de las siglas CELT, y director adjunto del Assessment Research Center, de las siglas ARC. Es un profesor asociado honorario del Center for Research in Assessment in Digital Learning, CRADLE, de la Universidad de Deakin, Australia. Sus publicaciones e intereses de investigación se centran en dos áreas: la evaluación educativa en el contexto escolar y de educación superior, con énfasis en la autoevaluación del estudiante y la medición de RASH, en particular su aplicación en la investigación educativa y psicológica. Entonces sus intereses docentes están ligados a la evaluación, desarrollo de pruebas y encuestas y metodología de investigación cuantitativa. Un gusto de tener a Sillán con nosotros, le damos la bienvenida y puedes comenzar tu presentación.
Okay, hello everyone. I cannot give opening in Spanish like Anna did, so sorry for that. Thank you, Anna, for your wonderful presentation, I think, which is very insightful and very useful for future research directions in the field of feedback. And I also like to thank the conference organizer for bringing so many excellent researchers all around the world together. I think this is a very brilliant idea. And so my presentation will focus on the, wait a minute. Okay, so in Anna's presentation, I think that she provides two excellent examples about the power of the self-assessment. I think the last two studies in her presentation. So my presentation also wants to extend this line of research. And the major purpose of my presentation is to articulate the interplay between the feedback literacy and the self-assessment based on reframing and integration of these two concepts. Okay. And the presentation will mainly based on these two conceptual papers. In 2017, Garen Brown and I developed a cyclical process model for self-assessment. And recently, David Callis and I reframed that model a little bit by integrating the concept of feedback literacy and highlighting its enabling role in the self-assessment process. Okay, why we want to bring these two concepts together and why we need to highlight them in the same places, I think that's because both of these concepts are very crucial for developing self-regulation and lifelong learning in higher education. To achieve self-regulation and lifelong learning, I think the students have to effectively seek, process, and use feedback from different sources. Okay, so they need feedback literacy. At the same time, they need to reflect on their own work against some appropriate criteria. So they need to have a good capacity to do meaningful self-assessment. And feedback literacy and self-assessment are intertwined, not only because they can inform each other, but also because they share some similar mechanisms influencing learning. Okay, first, both feedback literacy and self-assessment contribute to self-regulation and co-regulation. Self-assessment is a central process in self-regulation because usually it requires of students to monitor the learning process. And the self-assessment can also provide opportunity for developing co-regulation because input from others is also very crucial for the self-assessment process. On the other hand, feedback process are built on interactions with others. And through interactions, students can learn from others, which is a very typical behavior of co-regulation. And it provides opportunity for internalized self-regulation skills. Okay. And second, the active role of assessment of students is a common feature for both concepts. And it is also the key of the power on this on students' learning. Self-assessment by nature encourages students to assume an active role in the assessment process. Okay, and I think it's basically the defining feature of self-assessment, no matter how its process are enacted. Although in some scenarios, the teacher may initiate the self-assessment, they may design the assessment task or provide the assessment criteria, but it must be the student themselves who make the final or continuously make the self-assessment judgments. Similarly, only one student can be an active feedback searcher and user, and also the agents of their own change. They can be, receptive to external information and be able to use those information for improved learning. Self-assessment have many benefits, okay, no matter from theoretical or practical perspective. I think Anna just provided many good examples from the empirical studies. And also theoretically, self-assessment is compatible with the lifelong learning, which is a very important United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, okay. A huge amount of studies have shown that the self-assessment have a positive effect on many different learning outcomes. For example, the academic performance, the self-regulation, learning autonomy, self-efficacy, etc. However, it seems that the conceptualization of these two concepts, both self-assessment and feedback literacy, are not that solid as we expected they are. For example, there's no consensus regarding what is the standard self-assessment. Okay, although we understand that there might not be a standard self-assessment, and we might not need that either, because self-assessment could be done consciously or unconsciously, and both ways could be very effective. However, the problem with some unconscious, or in another term, implicit self-assessment, is that the absence of traceable evidence regarding what action students actually take and how they take for the self-assessment will make very difficult for us to monitor the process of a self-assessment, and very difficult for us to to design interventions to improve the self-assessment quality. In contrast, if we can make self-assessment explicit, okay, and then we can facilitate the intentional instruction, support, and intervention of the self-assessment. Therefore, I think to better use the pedagogical power of self-assessment, is desirable for us to turn or teach the student to turn the implicit self-assessment process explicit. Okay, through explicit process, so we can have many ways to demonstrate the good practice and teach the student how to do the meaningful self-assessment, and it is more likely for them to learn the skill and transfer the skill to new concepts, new context. Okay. Also, a recent meta-analysis done by my team and David Bao, showing that the self-assessment involving explicit feedback from others actually have a very significant, larger effect size than those self-assessment without explicit feedback. This is also a test that we really need to turn the implicit self-assessment into explicit. We all know that self-assessment should be more than just self-rating or self-rating, okay? And researchers and practitioners have designed many different self-assessment activities and have developed different instruments or tools that could be used in self-assessment activities. However, what matters more in the self-assessment research or practice is that the internal process. In other words, or from a pedagogical perspective, how we clearly describe a process of a structured self-assessment could be very useful for teaching and learning. Okay, so in 2017, we have developed a cyclical self-assessment process model, which involved actions, sequential actions, including the determining criteria, self-directed feedback seeking, self-reflection, and calibration. Okay, so you can look at this figure. It's more or less like a sequential process. When students engage in the self-assessment, firstly, they determine the criteria against which they will assess their own performance, okay? The criteria could be explicit, such as some formal assessment rubrics, or it could be implicit either, such as some standards internalized by the student from the previous experiences. Then they initiate a search for feedback regarding the performance from either external sources, for example, teacher feedback, test scores, or peer feedback, or they can seek feedback from internal sources, including the motivation, the internal states, emotion, etc. Based on all these feedback connected, students then can reflect on the quality of the process and product of the learning, and identify their own strengths and weaknesses. Then self-assessment judgment can be arrived. And this judgment is subjected to continuous calibration based on internal, based on some interactions with new criteria or different feedback sources. And this process shows that although self-assessment could be introspective action, but it is more about self, okay? the presence of others in addition to self plays a very crucial role in the self-assessment process. If students want to adopt a proactive role in self-assessment, they need to seek and use feedback from suitable others or from the learning environment. Therefore, the student feedback literacy could be a significant factor determining whether a student can conduct meaningful self-assessment or not, and determine whether they can really benefit from the self-assessment or not. Okay, that's for self-assessment. On the other hand, for feedback literacy, feedback research actually has been undergoing a transition from a teacher-centered view to a more learning-focused view. Okay, a learning-focused view emphasizes that the active role of students in making judgment about the quality of their own work, as well as taking informed action in enhancing their own work. So the term feedback literacy actually emerged under the learning-focused framework of feedback. And I personally think its conceptualization and discussion is still undergoing. I think a seminal work of feedback literacy is Calibration and Bao in 2018. They define feedback literacy as the understandings, capacities, and dispositions needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategy. And it has mainly 4 components: appracial feedback, make judgments, management effects, and take actions upon feedback. Subsequent work have tried to work out a list of core elements of feedback literacy in practice. Okay, for example, commitment to feedback as improvement. Appracial feedback is active process, elicit information to improve learning. Process feedback information. Acknowledge and work with emotions. Acknowledge feedback as a reciprocal process and enact outcome of processing of feedback information. Okay, and furthermore, 3 behavioral elements of feedback literacy were further highlighted and suggested to be embedded into curricula. These 3 behavioral components are seeking feedback information, and processing feedback information, and acting upon feedback information. Okay. By focusing on these behavioral elements, it is possible for us to bridge the feedback literacy and the self-assessment and bring forth the pedagogical implications of the interplay interaction between these 2 concepts. Okay. However, the line of research on feedback literacy up to now seems mainly focused on the external feedback, but less explicitly on internal feedback. Okay, internal feedback is potentially even more powerful because it can be developed independently of the teacher, and basically, I think the feedback has to become internal to have an impact on students' learning, because all information, no matter where it is come from, has to be interpreted by the students and before the feedback could be used. Okay, the seminal work by David Nichol on the internal feedback is that the internal feedback is the new knowledge that students generate by comparing their current performance against some reference information. Therefore, we borrow this idea from both the feedback literacy as well as the internal feedback. In the linkage with the self-assessment, we mainly focus on 2 behavioral components of feedback literacy, that is feedback seeking and generating internal feedback. And feedback seeking here refers to students intentionally eliciting information about their own performance for improvement purpose. On the other hand, generating internal feedback is about developing insights or oneself, constructing meaning from feedback information and use it for influencing future actions. Okay, such a refocusing not only maintain the emphasis on the active role of students in the feedback literacy or feedback process, but also extends the feedback literacy concept from mainly dealing with the external feedback to embracing the internally generated feedback at the same time. Okay, a little bit summary. Before we jump into the bridge between the self-assessment and the feedback literacy, I think we need to make two big ideas very clearly here. Okay, we are not trying to redefine these two concepts. Instead, we just want to reframe these two concepts with a purpose to bring them together so that we could have some pedagogical benefit from the interplay between these two concepts. Okay, so idea one, self-assessment is a learning process that students use to monitor and improve learning rather than just assessment methods. Idea number two, feedback literacy here is a capacity that students need for effective learning purposes, process, including the self-assessment. Okay, so again, we understand that these two concepts covers many other things, but in this conceptual endeavor, we want to focus on some points which can be used to facilitate each other. Okay, here we go. Excuse me. We reframe the self-assessment process a little bit by integrate the feedback literacy. The major difference in this reframing is that we highlight the enabling role of feedback literacy, that is feedback seeking and generating internal feedback in the process of self-assessment. When engaged in self-assessment, students still go through the steps from determining and applying the assessment criteria to self-assess reflection, to self-judgment and calibration. But in the whole process, feedback seeking plays an enabling role to support each step. For instance, the student may seek feedback on the appropriate list of the assessment criteria and their understanding of the criteria. Also, they may also seek feedback to refine the directions and the strategies of self-reflection and enhance the accuracy of the self-assessment judgment. The connected feedback has to be turned into internal feedback before it could be used by students for self-assessment purpose. Different reference information could be used to generate internal feedback, such as the assessment criteria, the feedback from teachers, peers, or other different types of comparators. It could be exemplars of work or rubrics, for example. And the use of different resource information may lead to different internal feedback, okay, which in turn may result in different self-assessment judgments. That means even for the same performance, the student might result in different self-assessment judgments because they might adopt different assessment criteria or they use the different source of information of the feedback, okay. Of course, it is worth noting that students can carry out self-assessment without seeking external feedback, okay. They can do it by themselves. And also they can cease the self-assessing when the initial self-assessment judgment is made. However, a purely internal self-assessment or a self-assessment judgment without calibration is more likely vulnerable to bias, okay. For example, the overconfidence, relying on the effort rather than the quality of the performance. And all this bias could reduce the usefulness of the self-assessment in improving performance and directing future learning, okay. In the interplay between these two concepts, they can facilitate or they can enable each other. From one hand, self-assessment has been regarded as one of the practice for developing students' feedback literacy in many of the literature. And when designed and implemented appropriately, self-assessment can provide opportunities for students to seek external feedback, generate internal feedback through comparisons about with different reference information about their own performance. And keeping practice of this kind are likely to enhance the students' feedback literacy because like other long-term capacities, the development of feedback literacy is a continuous and progressive progress. Okay. From the other direction, feedback literacy is also very important to facilitate self-assessment or maximize its power in students' learning. Okay, because feedback literate students are more likely to make meaningful self-assessment, and which in turn can result in better plans for future learning. Okay, and I think the enabling role of feedback literacy in the self-assessment process could be understood from two perspectives. First, seeking external feedback may enhance the accuracy and usefulness of the self-assessment because the external feedback facilitates the calibration of the self-assessment. Because if a student have a good feedback literacy, he or she have more intention to seek feedback and have a better understanding of how expertise, trustworthiness, and relational factors may influence the process quality of the feedback. So they are supposed to be more likely to search for relevant feedback, high quality feedback that can benefit their self-assessment judgments. Okay. And second, internal feedback could be generated during self-assessment. And those internal feedback can support different aspects in the self-assessment process, such as determine appropriate criteria, quickly identifying the strengths and weakness, and adjusting ongoing learning strategies. If the student have a better level of feedback literacy, he or she may generate better quality internal feedback with learning focused information. And so they are in a better position to use self-assessment results for the improvement purposes. Okay. In the following sessions, I will present some recommended practice of feedback alongside the different steps of the self-assessment. Okay, according to the cyclical model of self-assessment, we unfold the self-assessment process into 3 steps here. And each step, the self-assessment process carries some opportunity for developing feedback literacy. On the other hand, the feedback literacy can facilitate each step of the self-assessment in generating desirable outcomes. Okay, and for each step, we present some recommended practice that can facilitate self-assessment, and also we summarized one pedagogical principle that can guide the design of this feedback practice. Okay, let's go through this recommended feedback practice one by one. Okay, the first step of a self-assessment is determining and applying assessment criteria, right? So the principle for this step is to enhance the understanding and application of the criteria through feedback practice. In self-assessment, I think not only in self-assessment, in any learning or assessment practice, criteria carries very big potential to support students' learning when they are co-created or negotiated with the students, because that co-created assessment rubrics can make expectations for good performance transparent to students. Okay. Unfortunately, criteria are seldom transparent to students in our practice, and students' understanding of the criteria is sometimes taken for granted. And the feedback process support this step in that the teacher's feedback or the student's feedback-seeking behavior can help to clarify the criteria, and while at the same time, the feedback from students to teachers actually can surface the understanding of the criteria so that that information can inform teachers' follow-up teaching. Here is the example, okay, this figure. Teachers can invite students to brainstorm in pairs or groups the criteria for good performance. Based on this discussion, teacher and students can then co-construct rubrics, or if you prefer, a teacher constructed rubric can be shared and discussed with the students. Okay, the whole process is informed by feedback process involving both teachers and students. By arranging students' peer review or the analysis of exemplars of different quality, teachers actually enable the application of criteria and the students' appreciation of the quality work looks like. Through applying the rubrics to their own work and that of the others, students are able to practice the application of the rubrics, okay, so that they can refine their understanding of the criteria, and finally they can generate feedback insights for themselves as well as for their peers. So this is one example, so-called the recommended practice, feedback practice for the step 1 of self-assessment. Of course, there are many other ways, okay? Step 2 is the self-reflection. A core aim of the self-reflection is for students to generate internal feedback on their own strengths and weakness of the performance. So the important principle for step 2 of self-assessment is to make the internal feedback explicit, okay? As I said before, we can do self-assessment implicitly or explicitly, but explicit self-assessment seems to have much more advantages than the implicit self-assessment, okay? Especially for the self-reflection steps. Because although internal feedback plays a core role in the whole self-assessment process, it's especially important for step 2. In many cases, internal feedback can be generated implicitly. But if we can make those implicit internal feedback explicit by requiring they write account, voice out in terms of what they have learned from making comparisons, that will be much better for the self-assessment benefits. Okay, here's another example to showing how we can enact this principle. Okay, students produce a draft response to an assessment task. Okay, that is a draft performance, and make a preliminary self-assessment of their work. Next, they are primed to generate internal feedback through being exposed to reference information or comparators. The reference information would typically be other students' work requiring peer review or exemplars of different quality produced by private students. In relationship to this form of reference information, students' reflection on their own work by comparing their own performance with the others and drawing inferences from improvements, okay? And the process are made more explicit when students write reflective accounts of the difference between the work and others. We can borrow in some insight from the work of David Nichol, that if we ask some questions like, what are the main difference between your work and that of others? And from analyzing other work, what can you do to improve your own assignments? So on the basis of this self-reflection, of this questioning, students can develop and enact actions plans for improving based on the insight they derived from the comparisons they have made. Okay, so the internal feedback generated by students then can inform the future revision of the drafts. Step 3, okay. For this step, the principle is to facilitate calibration of self-assessment judgments through interaction with different feedback sources. As we discussed before, the initial self-assessment judgment should be subjected to continuous calibration, okay? And the calibration not only can increase the accuracy of the self-assessment judgment, but also can develop students' self-assessment ability over time. Therefore, the more thinking students have about the assessment criteria and more interactions with different feedback sources, the more benefits students are likely to obtain from the self-assessment. This figure presents one of the elaborative examples. Students submit their work first together with their self-feedback or self-reflection. Then they are randomly paired up and each student assesses their partner's work by providing both grades and written feedback according to the same rubrics. Okay, the self and peer grades of feedback can be compared. If the discrepancy is reasonably small, the process ends and the student revises the work. However, if the discrepancy between the self and peer feedback or grades is significant, the reviewees and the reviewer, okay, the student different roles in the peer review, need to discuss and justify their judgments and possibly recalibrate the self or peer grades feedback, okay? And then they compare again. If the discrepancy is still significant, then the teacher needs to intervene by reviewing the work as well as the self and peer assessment results and provide some recommended grades and feedback, okay? And this process could be more workload efficient if we have the support of online platform, because many of the actions could be done automatically by the online platforms. And I think this has good potential not only for bring extra benefits, academic benefits for the students, but also have a good potential to reduce the teacher's workload, okay? Because for most of the formative assessment task, this kind of approach can make the student engage in the self-assessment assessment process more, and is highly likely to reduce the time required from the teachers to marking, to feedback to the students, so we can save the instructor's time focusing on more useful pedagogical design tasks, okay? And this interactive calibration process can provide students with plenty of opportunity to interact with feedback from different sources, which may also help enhance their understanding of the criteria and strengthen the self-reflection as well as the calibration of the self-assessment judgments. Okay. Okay, here comes some conclusions or summaries. The enabling role of feedback literacy in the self-assessment process, I think, need to be more widely recognized and utilized to inform productive students' learning. As I said, past study, including the empirical study as well as meta-analysis, have consistently shown we need to make self-assessment explicit. And the feedback literacy could be a very good angle for both the teachers and students to be aware of this important message and provide a good angle for teachers to design some structured self-assessment activities which can encourage the student make full use of the feedback from different sources. Okay. In terms of the implication for our practice, I think first, feedback practice should be embedded purposefully within the self-assessment activities. Okay, so this purposeful and repeated practice, students can develop the feedback literacy, which in turn can help students better seek, generate, process, and use performance-related feedback information in self-assessment for enhancement purpose. Okay, when sustained development of self-assessment and feedback literacy is embedded into disciplinary curricula, students are in a better position to be developed for independence and lifelong learning. Second, when we implementing self-assessment, it is very important for the instructors to build a trusting, collaborative learning environment that is supportive for students to seek feedback. Because feedback seeking is always cognitively and emotionally demanding behavior for most of the students. So enhancing the availability of feedback and encouraging students' initiatives in seeking feedback is always crucial for useful, meaningful self-assessment. Thirdly, the scaffolding is necessary for students to make use of the feedback seeking for meaningful self-assessment. A valuable role of the instructors, I think, is that we could provide some example or models in terms of appropriate feedback seeking strategy in the self-assessment practice. Okay, for example, as a researcher, we always seek our peers' feedback on our own writing or research reports before we submit to a journal or agency. So that's, I think, is a good example for us to share with our students how to make use of the feedback in the self-assessment process. Okay, by demonstrating how they have sought feedback to improve their research to teaching, I think students can benefit a lot from this kind of real examples in life. Okay, it is also worth noting that the enactment of self-assessment and feedback literacy may differ across disciplines and learning tasks. For some learning tasks which have a fixed answer, okay, there is little space for particular self-assessment steps. For example, it's not so easy for the student to apply or select a different criteria, right? Because the answer is fixed. And therefore, some suggested feedback practice, for example, the constructing, applying different rubrics, as we discussed before, might not be so applicable or needed some adaptation in this kind of scenario. In principle, the more divergent the pool of response to a learning task, the more learning opportunity can be generated by self-assessment and feedback practice. Okay, I think that basically what I want to share with you. I will welcome any questions and comments. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Siyan. Muy interesante tu presentación, además con una propuesta muy concreta de cómo facilitar el trabajo docente en términos de hacer una retroalimentación más estructurada, más apoyada en los mismos estudiantes, así que nos va a dar muchas luces para la discusión final. Ahora voy a dar paso a nuestra tercera ponencia, que en este caso es del doctor Michael Henderson, que nos presenta el tema Retroalimentación vía video y audio, personal, poderosa y sostenible. El doctor Michael Henderson es profesor de futuros digitales en la Facultad de Educación en la Universidad de Monash. Es un experto mundial en el campo de la educación digital, en particular el uso efectivo de la tecnología en la enseñanza y el aprendizaje habilitados por Internet. En el año 2020, Michael fue identificado por The Australian como el líder del campo nacional en investigación en educación. Algo único de su perfil profesional es que su investigación abarca la primera infancia, escuelas, universidades y contextos de aprendizaje profesional. Esta amplia perspectiva le ha permitido negociar teorías y perspectivas relacionadas con las tecnologías digitales. Michael tiene un interés continuo en todos los contextos de aprendizaje habilitados por la tecnología. Sin embargo, sus proyectos de investigación actuales están generalmente alineados con los tres amplios campos de evaluación y retroalimentación, riesgo, entendido como bienestar y creatividad, y enseñanza-aprendizaje efectivos con tecnologías en línea. En particular, su investigación en retroalimentación de evaluación los últimos 5 años ha tenido gran impacto en la investigación y la práctica a nivel nacional e internacional. Bien, muy bienvenido, Michael. Muchas gracias por estar acá y te doy el pase para tu presentación.
Thank you very much. I may have to step up to meet all that lovely that praise. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. And I'm just going to set my chat window up.
Sí, se ve perfecto y se escucha bien.
Thank you very much. So welcome everybody, and good morning from Melbourne in Australia. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on and from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples of Australia. So today my mind has been blown by the fantastic presentations by Yancy and Anna, and I'm going to hopefully build on some of the ideas that they've presented on. So I'm going to apologize in advance to the wonderful translators, because I'm going to change my script a little bit along the way. So my apologies to you. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I understand feedback, and that's going to connect to the previous presenters. And then I want to shift into some of the current research that I'm doing that talks about the kinds of things that we can put into the feedback artifacts or information that gets provided to students, and that could be from teachers or other students, etc. And then I want to shift to a very pragmatic approach to it, and that's using video or audio as a media to enable us to provide richer and more nuanced or detailed ways of providing that performative information. Okay. So I've been privileged to come to know a number of researchers in the space and research around feedback over the years, and I've come to realize along the way that the more I know of this thing that I thought was very simple, this feedback thing, it just keeps getting more complex and more complex the more I research in the space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that complexity in a little bit. But like Anna did, I'm going to start off a little bit by framing where I'm coming from in terms of feedback. So just like for this little child who really needs to understand what naughty means to Santa, we need to understand how each presenter approaches feedback, because there are quite a few variations. So first of all, I think it's useful to have a little touch point of going, we often think of feedback as an input, or as Bowd and Malloy talk about, as a David Bowd and Elizabeth Malloy, they talk about as an input model. And here's a example from Hattie and Timperley, where it talks about that feedback is this information that's provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance. But of course, we've got a question, is feedback just giving of information? I think we all generally are now seeing feedback as a much more complex, and whether you're coming from a systems or kind of understanding or a more broader cognitive framing of feedback, we'd say, well, it's not just about the input, although that's important. So I'm borrowing on and building off the work from various people, and there are some on the screen here. So David Carlos and Bowden Malloy, and I'm connecting the work that Rolla and myself and David and Liz have done. And this is where we're really seeing feedback as a learner-centered process. And the two bits there are learner and process. So, David Carlos talks about dialogic processes, and Liz and David Bowd talk about processes whereby learners, about framing learners as the key focal point of any description around feedback. And we do the same in our recent book. But the interesting thing is that that second part where it talks about, it's about enhancing work and learning strategies. It's in order to generate improved work, or it's promoting their learning. There's this element of saying that feedback is about improvement. It's not about the labor of the work. And this is the thing that I think we often spark from, is in the conversations with educators and administrators and budget holders. Feedback is often framed as a labor, as in you do the feedback now. You have an hour to do feedback, give the feedback. And it's made this kind of labor-based discussion point. And I think that confuses the conversations that we want to have about what is effective feedback in terms of learning. Now, Anna, please forgive me. I took a couple of screenshots and I wanted to make a connection. So hopefully you're okay with this. So Anna offered up her own definition with a colleague, and there's some lovely similarities here, talking about information feedback is related to is any information related to performance that learners can use to improve their performance or learning. So again, it's this idea that there's something about improvement. Now, the thing that Anna sort of differs from mine a little bit is I stress the learner process in it, but I think we're on the same page. Thanks, Anna. Just saw the chat window. I think one of the things that we're both in alignment with is the importance of recognizing the learner's role in making any change. And that's the same from Yanxi, where it's about the learner doing things with this information, whether it's generating themselves or processing inputs from elsewhere. I wouldn't say it's a shifting views like Anna, but I think it's a shifting focus. In the research literature, we've seen a focus from going from teachers as providers to this question of, well, how do students engage in and activate and leverage information and generate it? And I agree that we need to focus on both. And so within this learner-centered understanding of feedback, really, I think the task that I want to talk about is how might teachers, peers, and others, but I'm not really focusing on teachers and peers, construct and deliver, because I think the delivery is a critical component. We often just say rubrics or text or video and things, and we treat them as these isolated, discrete artifacts that somehow, because of the media themselves, is so very different. And I think it's going to be a lot more complex story than that. Now, again, apologies, Anna. I love the model, and this was a masterclass to me of some really powerful work. And I'm going to focus in on the Anna's model, and I'm going to have a different take on it. And where it's talking about the feedback message. Now, in Anna's model, she talks about timeliness, level of detail, comprehensibility, accuracy. Now, I have a different set of criteria, and I want to share them with you. But this is where I'm focusing in on how do we construct that artifact. So we often want to provide rich and meaningful comments, but it all seems too much sometimes. It's very difficult to do everything, especially when we're working with large classes. But even if we're driven to do so, it's not always clear about what we should actually include in that artifact, that feedback information. So a decade ago, when I started looking into this space, I came to the conclusion with a colleague that there's no clear agreement in how assessment feedback should be designed. And there's a comma that's in the wrong place, so someone gave me some feedback about that. With the exception of a few people in this room, for instance, David Nicol, I think, who's in this room, I found some wonderful advice, but still there didn't seem to be an agreement, because I was looking for at the time as an educator, what should I be doing to do this really well? And I couldn't find that strong, clear advice about each of the steps. Now, since then, there's been a massive research, but there still is this search for powerful models of feedback construction and delivery. And I think there's been recently a lot of conversation around process, about the notion of what is feedback, what are the key elements of feedback and who's involved. But there's not as much about exactly what goes into that content. So going back, and you can see how old this is, because there's a much skinnier and younger me on the left. We started with a colleague and good friend, Mike Phillips, there with me, looking at how we might use media, this is my space around digital technologies, how we might use media to enhance the feedback process. And we started, and at the time, now this is a little bit old, it still works, I think. Now, I might just put this into the chat window in case you're interested. Now, this synthesis of the literature at the time, I think still works and it's still useful, but since then, there's been some other useful pieces of research, and I'm going to share my most recent work, which builds or goes further than this. So you're welcome to that as a model if that's of interest. But in that one, just like with Anna's model, we had issues like timeliness, but we also had clarity, and it's educative, it's got to be proportionate. It's got to locate students. And I'm sorry for going through these screens, but you have that link so you can go and look at this at your leisure at another time. But other things like enhancing task performance and ongoing dialogue and being sensitive to the individual. And we're going across here in terms of different framings of feedback, which at the time I didn't realize I was doing. Now, more recently, and this is where I'm apologizing to the translators, because I'm just throwing things on the screen that they hadn't seen before. More recently, I've been doing some work with some fantastic colleagues, and we thought, well, within a learner-centered framing, what does the feedback artifact look like? What should be in there? What makes it effective and clear? What helps students make sense of information and gives them every best chance at processing that information and acting upon it? Because my previous work hadn't been so clearly defined within a learner-centered framework. So we took 4 models, the Mark II model, that David Bowd and Elizabeth Malloy came up with, and Young and Carlos, the dialogic triangle model. We also borrowed on the feedback literacy framework, and then also from our own book, we sort of took these 4 models of what makes feedback effective. How do we understand feedback? Again, please forgive me, I'm not going to read through each of these elements because I'm taking you through a journey, but I'm happy to come back to these at question time if you like. But all of these are published and you can see them. But this is the bit that I want to share with you now. This is hot off the press. We're just framing it up. It's been an 18-month kind of journey of working with educators and students in a university setting. And this model that I'm coming up with here, and I'm going to show you more detail on it in a moment, is coming out from this idea of us taking a group of educators and a small group of students from each of those educators. And we looked at the text-based feedback information that the educators gave to the students. We then got the educators to go through that information and describe to us and label and tag every semantic chunk within that feedback artifact to tell us what their purpose was, what their expectation of the student was, what they were trying to do with it. We then went to their students, and for each of the feedback that they received, they did the same job. And so we could then track the alignment between the educator and the student, and trying to see where there was alignment, that they had the same understanding of purpose and intent, they had the same understanding, or the purpose of a certain kind of impact was actually occurring or not. And so we could look at it from the very granular level of language construction through to the overall sense and emotion of these feedback moments. And so through this process, building off those theoretical models, building off a large literature review and this empirical data, we started coming up with the idea that there's three components of effective feedback artifacts. One was the focus on the future impact. The other was promoting agency, so being aware that, that it's the learner that is the active participant in this feedback process. And it also a very conscious attempt at recognizing that we have to facilitate sense making. So we have to construct, or whoever is constructing this information has to do so that the students have best chance at understanding it. Now, these are pretty obvious stuff, but it was quite powerful when we went into the text level. Again, my apologies. Please don't worry about reading all of this model. I'm just going to give you, and I'm going to share the link with you here if you want to use it. So this hasn't, this is coming out of our series of papers. This is a synthesis of our papers, and we're about to publish this as well, but you're welcome to use this in this form. Hopefully you've got those links. So the previous round circle model is really summarizing these first two columns. And in these last two columns, we get right down to some very explicit direction about what we found in our study, which is not necessarily always going to work because it's a relatively small study, even though it was quite in depth. So context matters, of course. But nevertheless, in our study, we found that these items were particularly powerful. Simple things, for instance, explicit and simply constructed sentences. It's a very obvious bit of guidance, but when we looked at what the educators were doing and when they teased out what they were trying to say in their written text, in this case, we could see that they were overlaying multiple meanings and intentions in a single sentence, and the students did not have necessarily the same reading. Often they'd only see one intent and they might not actually get the main intent of a sentence. So we need to be careful not to overlay or assume, not to make these statements complex. Simple things like if you want a student to do something, then be careful about your language. Try to use imperatives and future tense notions to make it really clear to students. Then quite often, if you didn't do that in this study, the students would actually interpret something as simply being a negative criticism of the person, not as a statement of what they should be doing next. So it was a really interesting study in that regard. I wanted to share this here because I thought it built lovely, or it added to what Anna was doing and Yancy. But all of that seems like an impossible recipe. And a spoiler alert, even though I'm going to give you an example of how I find to best engage in this way, I found that I use a whole range of strategies to try and have best effect. So this is one, not the only way of doing it. In this regard, and in this presentation, I'm talking about digital video delivery, so audio, video, screencast. And just to give a bit of background, what we've found is that when written comments are provided in an assignment, often, not always, but often they're limited in depth because you don't have that much room or time, and it takes a while to construct those sentences in a nice, clear way that you're modeling to your students. So it takes a long time, and so it's limited in depth. But also quite often it's marred by ambiguity. So the kinds of phrasings that we use in formal writing, or indeed if we're simply circling things on a page, students, we've noticed, are not necessarily in a position to be able to interpret that very easily. In face-to-face discussions, we've come across the issue of, well, it's often impractical in classroom environments, but not all environments, but also it's dependent on student memory, and it's subject to performance anxiety. What we've seen is that students often will be worrying so much about what they have to say next or about how to look like they're being attentive. They're doing a lot of extra processing that they don't, that are getting in the way or is reducing their ability to actually engage with the commentary that is going on and to make plans about changing things in the future. So what we found is that digital media for us has been a fantastic media for us to do more in the same amount of time, but it doesn't inherently resolve all the problems, okay, or meet all the principles. Yeah, it's still a very hard and active process. It doesn't just happen. So I'm just trying to be very careful that to make it clear that I'm not arguing that video, for instance, just magically makes things happen better. Nevertheless, I have found it for me and for the studies that I've led to be particularly useful and effective. So I'm going to talk about some of the research findings in a moment, but first of all, I will describe what this is, what this thing is. Okay, so where do we start? Well, there's a lot of software and technologies that can do the job, and I'm not talking about anything that necessarily costs money. So you can do it with just from your phone and record yourself talking to your students. So I think for the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to talk about teachers providing information to students, but please do read into that it could be a student providing information to another student. So for me, I could record it on a phone, or I could use, I use a software program called OBS. You could use Zoom to create recordings and screencasts, etc. So it's not technology, sort of a specific technology. The focus is simply what you see here. It's just me talking to you. There's enough there so that you can see my facial expressions. The audio needs to be clear enough that you can hear me well. Sometimes I'll be at home or at work, and really the only requirement is that there's a degree of quietness. However, I have done these recordings on airplanes and in airports and everything else, and I apologize about the audio quality, but my students write back to me in my own examples. They've written back to me saying they love the fact that I was engaging with their work and just wanted to explain ideas as they had come to me rather than waiting 10 hours to then write some comments. So it seems to work in that regard. The length, 5 minutes. Try not to do much more than that. 5 minutes will give you 600-700 words on paper in English, which is far more than I would ever write normally. The process is a very important piece of this this work to make it sustainable. Because like Anna mentioned before, we don't want teachers to go crazy over the sustainability issues. So this is what I do. I will read, and this is the process that I work with all of our research participants, suggest that we read the work, engage with it, watch it if it's a performance or something else. And instead of making lots and lots of comments or annotations, I might at most color a few spaces on the document just to remind me about things I want to come back and talk about. So I've read it, and I normally would do that anyway. I would then stop and just ponder for 30 seconds, a minute, to think about the kinds of things that I think the best in my expertise could help my students. What are the things that I think would overall have the best and biggest impact? I don't want to comment on every single element of their work. I'm recognizing that there's only so much capacity. So I'm thinking about what's going to be the biggest impact. I then, after a minute of thinking, I then hit the record button and I start talking. And I've and I'll tell you in a moment the structure of my talking, but it's 5 minutes and then I hit stop. There's no script involved. They are very raw and they're just like this to me talking to you. There are ums and ers in there, and we've realized that ums and ers are like white space. It's thinking time. So it's okay for you to and take pauses. It's okay for you to make mistakes. Often I'll be thinking, I'll be talking to the students, and I'll realize that I could have explained this in a better way. So I'll say, stop. Here's a better way of thinking about it. And then I'll talk through that. And students in the surveys of my work, but in other works as well, talk about the authentic and real nature of the feedback. And so it's a very interesting experience. So I've recorded it and then I upload it. Done, 5 minutes. And in all honesty, that takes me a lot less time than me commenting and editing throughout someone's document. Of course, again, there is that situation where you might really want to focus in on textual constructions and grammar and things like that. And that if it's in that context, then you might spend a lot of time doing that. So here is the structure of what I do, and this structure has held up now over 6 or 7 years of doing various research projects with school teachers, university educators. And in this model, we suggest you start with a salutation and you work your way down. So this is a suggested sequence. And this dimension here, it says that, well, the wider it gets, spend more time. That's where your focus should be. So the salutation, of course, is very short. It's saying, hello, John, that kind of thing. The relational work is recognizing that if you do know the students, then feel free, because this is a feedback moment where we want a degree of candor. We want an openness to commentaries. And if a student feels that they're in an emotionally safe place, that they're recognized as a human, as having made effort and engaging, then we've recognized that students are more open to engaging with commentaries that they might otherwise see as critiques. So the third item, the goal of recording, is the most important. It is where you tell the students that you're only going to focus in on, you're going to take the moment to focus in on just some key ideas that you think is going to be the most useful. I'm going to give you an example in a moment. The point, it goes on to say you might spend a little bit of time in the value summary, you might talk about textual issues, but I tend to find, and including my most recent work, that educators, unless they are actively trained or engaged in this notion of what feedback is, they will often spend a long time on textual or superficial moments. Of course, unless you are teaching language and expression and written forms. But otherwise, if you're in a disciplinary space, the textual issues should not be taking the majority of time over the more substantive thoughts that you really want them to engage with. And you finish off again with their name. And what we found is by using names and recognition at the beginning and end, it really helps to cement a degree of rapport with students. The goal of recording, I'm going to come back to, is really important. This is where you might say something like, hi, John, it's fantastic to see this work. I've just finished reading it. I'm also really grateful that you got it in on time. I know you were struggling through your various drafts. So that's those first two elements. Then we go into the goal of recording. So John, this video is part of your feedback. Now, in the 5 minutes that I'm going to talk to you and talk about your work, I can say so much more than I can normally say when I write comments at the end of the essay. And that's why I do this. Having said that, I don't think it's a great idea to try and talk through all of your assignment. I just can't do that in 5 minutes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus in on 2 or 3 things that I think is going to be really useful for you as you look forward to your next assignment. If there's anything that I don't talk about and you're interested in, please do grab me and we'll have a chat. Okay, so here we go. And so by doing that, you're doing two things. You're telling the student about the purpose of this information, and then it's about improving. It's not about proving a grade, it's about improving in the future. And the second thing you're doing is you're giving the educator, yourself, license to only focus in on those handful of things that's going to make the most impact. And I've found that that's incredibly important, especially for sessional or part-time, new to career, early career staff who are not sure about what they should be focusing in on. So here's just an example. This is how rough it is. Now, I haven't shared audio in this because I don't want to take up too much time, but each of these, you see a very young version of me. And they're very rough. They're just us chatting. And this is the important thing, that we've done this empirical research later on, which is really showing that students are just reacting to the fact that this appears to be very in the moment conversation. We're sharing screens, we're talking through, we might be modeling different things. And remember, this is all happening in just 5 minutes. Okay. So I just want to quickly go now to some of the studies. There's a whole bunch of studies that I could draw upon, but I'm just going to draw on a few just to make a couple of points, because I know time is pushing on. So many years ago, we did a very small study, and it was interesting because it was self-reflective. And since then, we've taken these results and we've used it. We've compared these results with subsequent studies of larger groups of educators, both in schools and universities, and largely they still hold true. What we find that students do come back and say that they feel that these video moments, and remember, it's not just the video, it's that whole structure of why we're doing things. Okay, so they're focusing on the video, but remember, there's a great deal of design within each of those elements. But they're saying it's individualized and personalized, supportive, clear, prompting reflection, and it's constructed. That is, it's useful. Some of the weaknesses is that we've recognized, and this is coming back to the heading about being very personal, that students, a small proportion, but it was noteworthy, would comment that they didn't open the video straight away, that they had a degree of anxiety about opening the video. And I think it's because they had that sense that I or the other educators would be there sort of telling them off. And when they did, and they reported, when they did open the video and they saw me or the other educators smiling and saying, using their name, thanking them for their work, and then engaging with a critical commentary around what they could do to improve further, the students reported how how quickly that initial anxiety dissipated, and then they engaged in it. But nevertheless, it was very interesting about this initial anxiety and hesitancy to open the video in the first place. The other one was matching the feedback to the assignment. We've recognized that screencasting has an advantage in that regard. So when we're talking about something, we can actually point to it in their assignment. There are some risks, and that's we can, of course, not talk about all of the elements, but there may be a lot of work, and there might be a lot of corrective work as well. So it does need to be balanced, and sometimes you might go over that 5 minutes, or you might use a mixed media delivery of feedback, like you might use textual written comments as well as, and markups, as well as the video in those special cases. But from a teacher's perspective, what we found again and again when we talked to the educators, and we've now inducted several hundred educators into this method, and largely they'll say that's sufficient, although almost always they'll say the first handful of times took a long time for them to get comfortable, to get used to, and it took them a lot longer than written feedback. And so it took half a dozen times, and with encouragement, for them to get over that. Then afterwards, they talk about it being efficient. There's a degree of enjoyability, so that it was intellectually stimulating and felt like a conversation, and you were engaging with the students in an educative way. Time is flying. So I just want to do a quick comparison. So in another study where we did a survey, we looked at 3,000 students and we looked at the kinds of feedback artifacts that they were receiving. They believed that face-to-face and digital recording were very similar and this is self-reported, okay, so it's not triangulated with actual results, but they believed it had an impact on the learning outcomes. But when we had a closer look, and we looked at the various forms of feedback artifacts, we noticed that digital recording was largely rated higher in terms of usability, personalization, and detail. When we looked at whether or not any one of those versus any combination of those different forms of feedback artifacts, we noticed that it was rated higher overall. But we also then were able to dig down to students who had multiple without digital, so they might have rubric and text. And then we also looked at the students who had multiple with digital, so it might have been a rubric and a digital feedback, and again, that was rated higher. So there's something in the digital, but digital by itself is not as strong as when it is combined with anything else, including a rubric. Not all as it seems, though. There are some issues that we've noticed. For instance, length of audio recordings. We've looked at a number of studies where the recordings were only like a minute long. There's clarity of expression, poor audio quality, the timing of return, and all of these things had variable impacts on the student experience. And finally, there's no silicon bullet. So the modality itself is unlikely to be the only factor, but we think it really strengthens the richness of the cues that we're giving to our students so that they can more accurately interpret what we're trying to say. It also allows us to focus more on what we're trying to say rather than doing that extra layer of processing of written communication. The construction of feedback information is definitely a skill, and we need to help educators build that skill. The next piece of work for me is looking at that detailed model that related to text feedback in that large table that I showed you. And I'm going to be looking at that now in terms of how can we interpret that in a video mode, because it's not immediately usable. It's pretty close, but it's not quite there yet. Anyway, so hopefully that I sped up on a few slides just to try and keep to the time. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Michael, por tu presentación. Ahora voy a solicitar a Anastasia y a Sillan que puedan prender su cámara, porque vamos a pasar a la ronda final de preguntas. Muchas gracias. Entonces voy a partir, han llegado bastantes preguntas, y quiero partir con una pregunta para Anastasia. Dice Anastasia, ¿han medido el impacto de los sesgos cognitivos sobre la presencia o ausencia de sesgos cognitivos en los estudiantes? Si es así, ¿pesan más los sesgos disciplinares o los sesgos en estrategias de evaluación?
Yes, and I tried to answer this question in writing. So we are just entering the field. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I've been always interested in how students cognitively process feedback. And we are just entering this field. We just completed this series of studies, kind of micro experiments, which are adding up and giving us information about confirmation biases, about anchoring biases. But we are also looking at teacher biases as well. So this is a new field for us, and we've just started. What we are finding in teacher grading, which is a really interesting work that my student Carolina Lopera, who's originally actually from Colombia, from your neighborhood. So she is doing work on teacher grading and teacher feedback and how teacher biases manifest themselves in that regard. So for example, taking students who had weaker performance in the past and then taking students who had higher performance in the past and how grading would look differently in these conditions. And we're also developing mechanisms and processes for debiasing both students and teachers. So again, this is sort of newer work for us. We just submitted a couple of manuscripts, so be on the lookout, and I'll gladly share our work as we proceed, kind of dive deeper into this.
Ok, muchas gracias, Anastasia, por tu respuesta. No sé si alguien más quiere opinar respecto a eso o prefieren que pase a otra pregunta individual. Pueden levantar la mano o hacer un gesto. Voy a pasar a otra pregunta individual. Tengo ahora varias preguntas para Sillán. Voy a partir con una. A ver, dice, muchas gracias por su reveladora participación. Tengo una pregunta sobre el marco de alfabetización para la retroalimentación que diseñó David Carles. Si tomamos un ángulo diferente, podemos ver las 4 habilidades importantes de los alumnos que son alfabetizados en retroalimentación como 4 procesos críticos que los estudiantes deben hacer o seguir para hacer un buen uso de la retroalimentación y mejorar el aprendizaje. Sí, claro, por supuesto. Dice, bajo el marco de alfabetización que diseñó David Carles, ese es como el contexto. Si tomamos un ángulo diferente, podemos ver las 4 habilidades importantes de los alumnos que son alfabetizados en retroalimentación como 4 procesos críticos que los estudiantes deben hacer o seguir para hacer un buen uso de la retroalimentación y mejorar el aprendizaje?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think basically I agree with your viewpoint because this really depends on how we interpret the different definition of the feedback literacy. Okay, if we look at the feedback literacy from a capacity perspective, then that 4 component could be 4 components of capacity students need to make to become feedback literate students. But on the other hand, if we took a behavioral perspective regarding the feedback literacy, then those 4 components could be 4 important actions or process the student needs to go through in order to make the feedback really useful for them in terms of the improved learning. So basically, I think I agree. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Voy a aprovechar, Yancy, de hacerte otra pregunta que aparece acá. Dice, la autorregulación requerida para desarrollar una autoevaluación efectiva depende principalmente de la edad o del nivel de conocimiento de la temática en estudio sobre el cual se solicita dicha autoevaluación.
Is that all, the question?
Y después dice, por cierto, adicional.
Okay. Okay. I think.
Dice, al final dice, por cierto, adicional a la tradicional heteroevaluación.
Okay. I think there are a lot of past studies have shown that the accuracy of a self-assessment actually increases with the age, the maturity, psychological maturity, as well as knowledge level. So, of course, basically these factors are intercorrelated in reality. So, I think accuracy of a self-assessment, of course, is very desirable feature of meaningful self-assessment, because if you want students to have some justifiable or correct follow-up action, you really want students to have accurate self-assessment judgments on his or her performance. However, I think the importance of self-assessment accuracy in improving the learning does not mean that we have to put the accuracy of a self-assessment as a must for doing the self-assessment. Or in other words, we need to ask ourselves some questions like, if we know that in some scenarios, the self-assessment is not so accurate. For example, some very young kids, kindergarten or primary 1, primary 2 students, we can foresee that the self-assessment might not be very accurate. In these scenarios, do we still need to do the self-assessment? If yes, what kind of benefit they can have from that inaccurate self-assessment? Or what kind of scaffolding we need to provide for our students in order to make them benefit from the self-assessment, even though they cannot produce some very accurate self-assessment judgment. So I think that's a very important question we need to ask when we researching or practicing self-assessment. Personally, I think the answer is yes. Even though the self-assessment is not so accurate, we still need to promote the self-assessment. But of course, we need to provide some more matching scaffolding for our students in order to make them aware the possible of the inaccuracy of the self-assessment and make them to benefit from the self-assessment process rather than the final product, the self-assessment judgments. Because what really matters is the self-assessment process, which can really enhance the students' metacognition or self-reflection. Yeah, thank you.
No sé si alguien de ustedes, Anastasia o Michael, quieren agregar algo. Levanten la manito ahí para yo estar viendo por si quieren hacerlo, ¿ya? Si se fijan en Question and Answer, hay algunas preguntas que yo voy a leer en español, pero en ocasiones están en inglés, así que igual pueden estarlas mirando por si de repente hay una confusión de traducción, puede ser bueno también. No sé, Anastasia, si quieres agregar algo.
Sure, I could try. So we are looking at self-assessment. Yanzi and I are looking at the same construct of self-assessment, but from a different angle. So I'm focusing more on self-assessment as a process through which students generate self-feedback. So I'm not as focused on the outcome of self-assessment. But in general, self-assessment is a very complicated phenomenon and beast. I know I'm stating the obvious here, in that if students are overconfident, then we get, Dunning-Kruger cognitive bias, unskilled and unaware of it. If students are underconfident, then they will not engage with tasks because they lack this initial confidence required to really jump into the task and engage with feedback. So we need to scaffold them. We need to provide them with variety of materials, right, to help them generate this effective self-feedback, right? So it's not necessarily we are expecting the students will be spot on in terms of assessment. So it's not about the outcome. It's very much about the process in assessment. And again, having teachers model how to engage in self-assessment is very important. So as I showed in our studies with the basic demonstration with rubrics and exemplars, students' performance significantly improved after a basic training session that lasted no more than 45 minutes. So just by explaining how we can use a rubric or an exemplar for self-assessment, how we can extract criteria, students were immediately able to improve. And just imagine using it, not just over one occasion, just using it repeatedly and showing students how to do it. And when I think about self-assessment, and responses to feedback. I often, and I'm sure colleagues it will resonate with you, when we get comments on our articles, right? When we submit articles for publication, we receive comments from the reviewers. In many cases, we have initial really negative and visceral reaction to some comments. We sometimes welcome those comments, sometimes we really dislike them, yet we always and consistently respond to every single one of those comments. So when I think about it, and when I talk to especially to my PhD students in this case, we think, how do we structure our environment, our instructional processes and tasks in such a way that our students are also encouraged to engage with what we provide? And one of the appropriate responses would be not accepting feedback, right? So a lot of considerations here.
Muchas gracias, Anastasia. Ahora tengo una pregunta para Michael. Agradecen la presentación de Michael y preguntan algo relacionado con comillas, la comprensión de los comentarios que menciona en la presentación. Y acá se pregunta respecto a esto de dar sentido a la retroalimentación, que a veces es muy difícil, y el equipo con que trabaja esta persona dice que a veces a los profesores tienen dificultades para dar sentido a los comentarios, pero descubren que a veces dar sentido y la utilización de la retroalimentación ocurren simultáneamente cuando los estudiantes comprenden la retroalimentación. Entonces hay como una mirada acá en esta pregunta del chat que hacen al doctor Henderson respecto al sentido, al hacer sentido del feedback.
Yes, thank you. I think it's interesting. At the heart of this question is the thing that drives, I think, Anna, Yancy, myself, and most other feedback scholars, where we're trying to figure out the different elements of the feedback process and how each of these things operate and what kinds of factors influence them. In this regard, and I'm reading the English version of the question, and it's saying that there's a difficulty in this wonderful person's work of trying to distinguish between the moment of sense making and utilization, and it's this blurry kind of line. And I think we've got two things there. One is that the notion of sense making in my work, and maybe David Nicol, who's online, who's also got very strong thoughts about sense making as well, might have an extra idea here. But in my mind, sense making is only one of the three components of the feedback process. But it's particularly about trying to understand what this information is in relation to what they need to do. So when I talk about sense making, it's not about simply do the students understand the words, but it's about understanding the intent, the purpose of those words, and rationalizing it in terms of what does this mean for me. So that is a broader sense of sense making beyond perhaps an information processing pure approach, in which case then the blurriness that you're seeing in your work between this moment of sense making or making sense of these inputs and the utilization of it, that blurriness is really quite understandable if it's coming from my angle, because it's about making sense in relation to what to do. And it actually sounds like you're doing some great work if they're cracking on and utilizing it straight away.
May I? So I see parallels, right? And first of all, Michael, I was so impressed with this is a technological skill of level 82 to be able to take pictures during my presentation, insert them into your slides, and then casually present them. And I must say that your picture taking capabilities improved from task 1 to task 2. So from one slide to another, I noticed very significant improvement. So well done. But in this case, I see parallels in what we're doing. So in my model, if you think about processing, we have cognitive processing, we have affective processing, we have behavioral processing, right? So in cognitive processing is, do I understand this feedback? And behavioral, do I know what to do with this feedback? So your sense making and utilization is kind of on the intersection of these two components. But interestingly, I would like to throw a curveball. In the study in Singapore that we mentioned, in the study where we had 3 waves of data collection, we collected a lot of feedback artifacts. And we had interviews with teachers. We asked, what was your intention with this comment? What was your intention with this particular piece of feedback? And then we had students we asked students the exact same question. We said, what do you think your teacher's intention was here? We had a complete mismatch between those two areas. So people in general, and if you go into basic science, and a cognitive psychologist in me goes into basic science a lot, so there are lots of lab studies that show that people are really awful at getting other people's intentions. So even in email, when we write an email and we ask participants, what do you think the person who wrote an email, what did he or she think, or what did he or she what kind of emotion he or she felt? People guess at random, absolutely at random. So in our case, I think it's our job, and it's kind of making me even more convinced about it. So it's about making our comments, if we are providing comments, very explicit. So relying on students and expecting students to figure out our intention, it's too much. We're asking too much of them. So maybe we as instructors should be more explicit in the function and the purpose and what you're trying to accomplish with each particular task.
Right. Okay, just one point to echo Michael and Anna. I think the students' understanding of the intention of assessment, especially the self-assessment, I think is very crucial because it's largely determine whether the student can do a realistic self-assessment based on their understanding of the intention. For example, the student understand that the self-assessment will be accounted for the final grades. 100% they will overestimate themselves, right? So those overestimation will definitely useless for their learning improvement. However, if they can really understand the self-assessment purpose or whatever feedback from the teachers is for the learning improvement, I think they will have adopt a totally different set of cognitive behavioral mechanism to deal with the teacher feedback or self-feedback. Yeah.
Muchas gracias, Yancy. Y aprovecho que tomaste la palabra para hacer una pregunta que apareció en el chat, que ya contestaste, pero quizás sería bueno también hacerlo al público. Dice, ¿no cree, es una pregunta para ti, dice, ¿no cree que colocar los criterios de evaluación como la fuente de datos más importante para la autoobservación es muy limitante? Especialmente porque las diferentes fuentes de información generan diferentes tipos de retroalimentación. Por ejemplo, si los estudiantes comparan una explicación escrita que ha producido sobre un proceso con un diagrama que representa ese proceso, podrían aprender algo único a través de esa comparación textual gráfica, algo bastante diferente, pero tan importante como lo que aprenderían al comparar con la evaluación rúbrica o criterio. ¿No deberíamos darle a la retroalimentación un papel más importante que simplemente obtener mejores calificaciones?
Thank you for your question, David. I foresee that you might with this question actually, because when I saw you in the room, yes, first of all I agree that the criteria, or we can say the official externally standardized criteria, should not be the sole anchor of the self-assessment or internal feedback. And the comparison can happen between the comparator and the student's then own performance. So my meaning is that the student's learning can come from any comparison between the student's own performance with any comparator, in addition to the official criteria. But one more thing I want to clarify that is probably I did not say that in my presentation is the assessment criteria in my model or in my presentation does not necessarily to be the official or the standard answer of the assessment task. The official standard answer could be one of the criteria, but more importantly, the student, which is also a space of the self-assessment, can provide opportunity for students' learning. The student can also adapt some other criteria. For example, they can use a self-reference, okay? Whether my performance this time is better than the last time, or they can even use a long reference criteria if that's useful for their learning. Say, whether I have done a better job than the student sitting next to me. And of course, they can use some standardized reference or internalized standardized reference criteria, whether I have achieved my personal goal on this assessment task, okay? And whether my writing or my understanding of this topic is better than what I have produced for the previous assessment task. So I think the criteria here, probably I need to change another term, covers many things, okay? Or in Debbie's term, it could be the comparator, okay? Anything or any reference information which is useful for students' comparison, I think it could be the criteria. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Yancy. Y tengo acá una pregunta para Anastasia. Primero felicitan la presentación y la organización de los distintos modelos. Y la pregunta dice, ¿hay experiencias e investigaciones que documenten, que tú hayas realizado, tu equipo, el aporte de la retroalimentación de pares al modelo que ustedes presentan? Sí, claro. ¿Hay experiencias e investigaciones que documenten el aporte de la retroalimentación de pares al modelo que usted presenta? No te escuchas, estás muteada.
Yeah, sorry. Is it the question that I tried to answer with the experiencias y investigaciones que documenten? Is it the question in the Q&A that I tried to answer? Yeah, because the translation. Yeah, so the model in our model, the model is more of a, yes, the model is more of a framework of how to think about the mechanisms of interaction between students and feedback message. So if you recall, in the model, we have source of feedback. So feedback may come from the teacher, from the computer, from the task itself, and from the peer, but all of this feedback ultimately gets transformed into self-feedback for our understanding, current understanding of the interaction between student and feedback. So definitely peer feedback fits very nicely. In my team, we haven't explored peer feedback in great detail quite yet. So I even encourage Sandra to join us and maybe do some work. Can you replicate the work that we do with teacher feedback or with instructional materials, and look how it operates with peers.
Bien, es una muy buena invitación. Gracias. Y tengo acá una pregunta que yo creo que puede ser también para, bueno, primero voy a hacer una pregunta, la fue contestando Michael, pero la voy a hacer para Michael. Dice, si tienes alguna idea respecto a si los estudiantes efectivamente abran, escuchan todos los comentarios, pensando un poco que a veces se les entregan los comentarios escritos sobre las evaluaciones y ellos no necesariamente lo examinan, como alguna imagen que puso alguno de ustedes de tener muchos trabajos y esperar que los vayan a buscar, ¿cierto? Si eso no pasa con los mensajes de audio.
It's a great question. One of the very first things I read when I started to engage in a scholarly fashion with the notion of feedback was a series of papers that had this commentary about students never picking up their assignments to look at the feedback comments and basically educators complaining. And I was fascinated by this. So for several studies, and I think one of them we had, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 students respond. And I put this question in saying, you know, did you look at the feedback and how much of it did you look at? And again, maybe the students are lying, but 98% said they read it. And a smaller proportion said they were going to do something with it, but they said they read it. And so I'm fascinated by this kind of strange, it's like the myth of students never looking at the feedback. And I think it might be in certain contexts and certain disciplinary cultures maybe, and certainly if students have come to learn that feedback commentary is not useful, is not actionable, is hard to make sense of, it doesn't actually lead anywhere, then certainly why should they even bother looking at it? But certainly in my survey-based work, the students seem to be collecting it. I have gone and in comparative studies between digital feedback and written feedback, asked students to report on how much of the written or the feedback that they watched, and I could triangulate certainly in the video format and also the written format, because I could see whether they downloaded it, but I could not measure how much they read. But in terms of the video, I could see how much they watched the video. I asked them, did they look at it? How much did they look at it? Did they look at it several times? It turned out that the students in a secondary school context on average looked at the written feedback 4 or 5 times. With the video feedback, they only looked at it just about 1.5 times. Remember, it's an average. And we were flustered by this because all of our other data from the same set was talking about how students found the video feedback to be very valuable. And we thought, what's going on here? And so we went back to a small subset and asked them about this. And it turned out that the students were looking at the written feedback several times because they were trying to make sense of it. They couldn't quite figure out what the teacher was doing, or when they circled something, they couldn't figure out what the handwriting was saying. So they would come back and look at it again a bit later on. So it was a very interesting experience there. In terms of the video, they were saying they didn't need to go back to it so much because they were reporting that they understood what it meant. However, if you look at cognitive theories around multimedia processing, we do see, though, that there is an inflation of student or learner confidence about them saying that when they watch videos, educational videos, that they understand the ideas. There's an inflation there from a video effect, if you look at May Marino's work. So that's one thing we haven't quite looked at in terms of double checking that aspect. Nevertheless, they do seem to be accessing it. They do seem to be watching it all the way through, but we have recognized that too much commentary doesn't go anywhere. As an expert, you've got to figure out the 3-4 things that's going to have big impact and engage in a dialogue. Recognize this feedback moment is not the only moment. It should be in a dialogic kind of understanding. So take the moment to do the best impact, not try to tackle everything.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Ahora tengo las 2 últimas preguntas y espero que puedan participar todos porque son para los 3 y en la medida que tengan opinión va a servir. Esta es una pregunta de Dave Nichol y que creo que puede ser útil, que pueden de alguna forma interesar a los tres. Dice, este es un comentario de un estudiante de economía que estuvo expuesto a comentarios basados en comparaciones autogenerados. El proceso de comparación da estructura de la retroalimentación autogenerada que se produce cuando veo otro trabajo. Creo que debido a que se necesita más esfuerzo personal para generarlo, tiene mucho peso. Si hubiera comenzado este proceso de retroalimentación autogenerada al principio de mi carrera universitaria, sería mucho más competente en él y pensaría que necesitaría menos retroalimentación de los maestros, ya que tendría la confianza para construir mi propio sistema de retroalimentación. Pueden ver también la pregunta en el chat que está en el idioma original.
I can go. It's not, it's more of a, as we say in conferences, right? It's more of a comment than a question. So I definitely agree, because this is what we are finding in our work. So when we have, again, providing students with rubrics and exemplars and encouraging them to engage in this meaningful comparison, to take their work and compare it to these exemplars, students generate really effective feedback, and in the end, they learn how to improve. So for the university level students, and I think Yanzi answered the question about developmental levels, we are finding that rubrics and exemplars and different types of comparisons, the use of comparisons, they do not work as well with the younger students, and expectably so, because they are not as metacognitively sophisticated, so they don't have their working memory capacity is not as wide, so there is a tremendous cognitive load when they need to read their work and extract criteria and compare. So it needs to be much more scaffolded, much more guided, and much more on a smaller scale. So kind of dissecting every task into smaller units and then encouraging them to engage in this process of comparisons on that level. So again, we're doing some work on developmental levels, starting with kindergarten and finishing with the university. And this process is really effective for, again, college level and up, in high school level also, but not so much middle school down.
Yeah, I think I agree with Debbie and Anna. The self-generated feedback, I think it could be regarded as an ultimate goal of the assessment or a self-assessment at least, because what we really want to develop of students is to make them be able to self-learn, to be independent and lifelong learning. So for a lifelong or independent learner, the student have the ability to generate self-feedback, which could be useful for their future learning. So yeah, I agree.
But we still, it's interesting, Andy, and this, we often talk about this idea that we want our students, and I've done it myself, so we want our students to be independent and not rely on our feedback. But then when I do this exercise, when I have my students conduct this non-academic setting feedback exercise, we realize that we seek feedback in all these domains. We want feedback, we need feedback. When we are selecting an outfit to go out, we go and seek feedback. When we bake a pie or we cook a meal, we do seek feedback and we receive feedback and we rely on it. Because without it, we're constantly kind of calibrating ourselves. So there is nothing wrong with students relying on feedback and wanting and asking for feedback, but I agree with you that helping them to generate effective self-feedback is, I guess, our goal, because we also want to help teachers not to invest, not to devote their career and all of their time to provision of feedback, because it's very time consuming.
Yes. Feedback seeking, I think it's really, okay, the self-generated feedback, I think the students still need feedback from different sources. For example, just like Michael just mentioned, the video or audio feedback. If we bake a pie, we can seek feedback from YouTube, for example. Okay, that's definitely external feedback. But that kind of feedback, to me, I think is part of the self-feedback process. Of course, the student rely on some external resources. Rely on the external resources, but the students self-directed generate the internal feedback. So that's, I think, what I emphasize, the so-called independent. Not mention that we do not need any external feedback. Definitely we need external feedback. It's just the feedback is provided by others or is self-directed, sought by the students. I think that's the major difference.
En ese sentido, solamente para tomar esto que aparece acá en el chat, ¿a ustedes les parece que el feedback, pensando un poco en que el feedback tiene que ser de calidad y hablan o se ha hablado del uso de imperativos, pregunta David acá en el chat, ¿ustedes les parece bien ocupar preguntas orientadoras en el feedback, permitiendo algún espacio de metacognición, o prefieren que sean indicaciones más explícitas respecto a la oportunidad de mejora? Es una pregunta que está en español.
And apologies, who was that directed to?
Es una pregunta para todos, no está puesta en preguntas y respuestas, sino que está puesta en el chat. Y básicamente lo que se está indagando acá es si el feedback es importante que sea muy explícito, o bien a ustedes les parece bien que genere un espacio de metacognición y por tanto que sea algo un poco más amplio, como con preguntas orientadoras o con contrapreguntas respecto a lo que el estudiante tiene que mejorar.
I'm happy to kick off there. I've come to the understanding that the answer is yes to it all, depending on the context. I think in certain behavioral contexts, or where you can have explicit behavioral performances, or there are explicit processes that might be relevant to particular discipline or outcome, you can provide very explicit information to a student about what should be done, or exemplars or other kind of comparative kind of data. But what I've found that has been really interesting is to engage in students in a bit of a thought piece. Often when I'm talking to students, and you can do this so much easier when you're doing it in audio or video, because you can, through your voice, show that you are questioning whether this is accurate or not, and you can get the student to engage in a reflective moment where, for instance, I might be saying, I noticed that you did this thing in your work, and I'm wondering if you did this because you connected this theory with this idea, or, and I'm proposing to them about how I'm understanding their work, and I'm asking them to think about how they came to be. And then I can make a proposition. I can say, so if that's the case, then I think you might really like to read this bit of work, because it might help you make the connection between these two ideas, because at the moment it doesn't make sense, or something else. And so I can use these moments to get them to think through their processing, think through how they came to this idea and what they're drawing upon, even though in the written form, I'm making it very explicit that we always make judgments about what underlies the written form, so I think it's quite fun and useful to do it at that more complex and meta level.
May I? So I agree with Michael, and I agree with the question from Diego. It would depend. The answer is it would depend. It depends a lot on the background knowledge. So if students do not have background knowledge, so no matter how many questions you ask them, if they don't have anything, so it's like in critical thinking, you need the actual factual information in order to manipulate it and critically think about it. You need the actual facts, you need the actual knowledge. And same goes for any domain of feedback. You need this basic prior knowledge in order to engage students in this deeper processing and this metacognitive and all this metacognitive skills. I, again, often reflect from real life. For example, I take trapeze classes. And when I first, when I fly down, the instructor yells, drop, and I let it go. And I know that if I miss them this second, it's not going to work. But then later, as I, gain expertise, I can already reflect. I can differentiate between a split second here and split second there. So I don't need as much instruction from the actual coach. So similarly with the students, so initially and with the younger kids, they need very explicit instruction. They need very explicit guidelines, but then as they accumulate knowledge, they would be, it's perfectly appropriate for PhD students, even for college level students, to ask questions. And I actually encourage, and in some cases, ask my students, it's a requirement for every, when they take notes, to have question at the end of the paragraph, so that I know that they engaged in the reflection. So they're writing. So again, it's part of this self-feedback process in which they ask themselves a question and then answer it. So it's, again, depends on background knowledge, and it depends on the level of expertise and context.
Yeah, yes, I agree. I think it's more or less about if we look at this from a wider perspective, I think it's about education, because of course we need to differentiate the feedback content as well as the feedback, the way we provide feedback for our students. So I think the major purpose for us to do this is to develop them, finally to become someone who can ask themselves questioning and seek some useful information for action after the graduation, when there is no teacher, there's no classmates available for them for the feedback. So yes, and the schools and during the schooling, we do need to equip them with the different skills, different strategies, let them know how to seek, use feedback in different contexts, I think.
Bien, quiero agradecerles mucho la buena voluntad de contestar tantas preguntas, porque fue un panel con mucho interés por parte de la audiencia que tenemos, pero en honor al tiempo tengo que ir cerrando esta actividad. Por eso quiero agradecerles a todos los participantes, tanto a cada uno de ustedes, los panelistas, pero también a la audiencia que se ha mantenido en este tiempo. Y así damos por finalizado el panel 9, como también cerramos este segundo encuentro internacional virtual en educación superior. Creo que ha sido un buen panel para poder concluir esta actividad de manera destacada. Sabemos que ha sido una larga, intensa e interesante última jornada. Tuvimos 2 paneles inmediatamente, uno tras el otro. Y agradecemos a todos a quienes han mostrado gran interés y lealtad al participar en esta actividad durante estos 8 días, 9 paneles. Creemos que como Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación de la Universidad del Desarrollo hacemos un aporte respecto a los desafíos de la educación superior para Chile y también para otras partes del mundo. De esta forma, pensamos que podemos aportar a entregar herramientas para promover aprendizajes significativos y profundos en nuestros estudiantes, y también colaborar en una mejor experiencia docente que sea más enriquecida teóricamente como también reflexivamente. Así que espero verlos en una próxima oportunidad y el próximo año volver a iniciar un tercer encuentro de esta naturaleza. Muchas gracias Anastasia, muchas gracias Michael, muchas gracias Yancy y muchas gracias a todos los que están acá.
Muchas gracias a todos.